Hi, everybody. Nice to see many of you again, even if it's only virtually. My name is Kathleen Garland. I'm a senior lecturer in the environmental management program. And I think I've been doing teacher training to work for Envirothon. I don't know how many years it is now, but it's not enough. And it's one of my favorite things to do is to be able to work with you and to work with your students in this program. And I can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to us actually eventually getting back to our 3-day on campus somewhere marathon of being with students and being with you and being with the whole team. It's such fun and I miss it a lot. My topic today is brownfields and site redevelopment, restoration and redevelopment of degraded lands. And I took a look at what is required from our Texas Envirothon questions. So hopefully I will cover that for you. But before we start, I really wanted to know, is there anything in particular you want me to cover about brownfields? Any particular questions you have? Because I can usually track down a material or bring something in that will address that specifically.
Perhaps you could help me because I'm kind of confused about what actually constitutes a brownfield site.
Okay, and I'm definitely going to cover that because I know definition is like one of the first things that's supposed to be covered here. So I'm going to do that right away. But so I'll cover definitions for sure and try to explain clearly what that is, give you some great examples. So brownfields and the restoration of degraded lands, it's been an opportunity for us since the year 2002. So I want to give you a little bit of the history, those definitions, some examples, and then we're going to look at the process of what you have to do in order to do this, in order to restore these lands through the process that has been defined in terms of brownfields. This is my favorite presentation slide right now that I have. I have these great slides with endangered species on them. And so, of course, this is a sea turtle, but I just love to be reminded why we do this. And we do this because we're protecting endangered species, including us. So the Brownfields Amendment and the development of brownfields came out of issues around the Superfund law, right? And CERCLA, which is Superfund, CERCLA, the Comprehensive Environmental Restoration, Compensation, and Liability Act, affectionately known, or maybe not so affectionately known as Superfund, requires that we clean up historic contamination. And this is legacy contamination. This is contamination that threatens public health and the environment. However, to fall actually under Superfund, you have to have imminent threat. So, for example, here in Houston, the San Jacinto River pits are some dioxin-laden waste pits that were developed right on the banks of the San Jacinto River back in the 1960s. Over time, the river shifted. It began eroding that material away and putting it right in the river. And so it's a highly toxic material. It's directly impacting the river, the wildlife and the animals in the river, the ecosystem, and the inhabitants around the river and people who use the river. So it went practically straight to the national priorities list because of that imminent threat. But there are a lot of other old industrial sites around where, there's been no indication that they're an immediate imminent threat, but they're still not something that people want to get involved with. Most of them, although not all, are in urban areas. I'll give you a non-urban example. It's kind of urban, I guess. Butte, Montana, which was impacted both by copper mining and by vermiculite mining and asbestos by a number of different companies. The whole town's a brownfield. So, and parts of it are Superfund sites, but the whole town has been contaminated. So, but that's kind of a more rural area. Again, Montana isn't a big urban center, although Butte's not small, but and much of that contamination is on the outskirts or literally outside of town. But in most cases, we're talking urban areas. And so what happens, over time, these sites got abandoned or they got reused as another industrial site for a while, but eventually they became empty. They wound up with abandoned lots, abandoned buildings. This developed some problems for the cities because people started using these for illegitimate uses. We had everything from homeless encampments to problems with vermin to, then the development of crack houses and gang activity. And so the cities didn't want these empty lots around. They were very upset about them, but nobody would buy them. And they wouldn't buy them because of a specific provision under CERCLA. So even though these sites weren't Superfund sites, they were still impacted by Superfund. And they were impacted by Superfund because of the owner-operator definition of Superfund. And that definition says that if you owned or own the facility or operate or operated it ever, you're liable for cleanup on the site if contamination is found there at the level that it might invoke CERCLA. And people just didn't want to take the risk of that. And so what they did is they went outside of town. And so instead of buying these old urban plots of land, they would go out to what we call a green field, which is an undeveloped parcel outside of town. And we started to develop industrial parks and stuff outside of town rather than redeveloping the urban core. And so cities finally came. I mean, they came for a long time. They finally came to the federal government. And under the first George W. Bush administration, a law was passed called the Brownfields Amendment. It's the Small Business Liability Relief and Brownfields Redevelopment Act. And it's affectionately known out here in the profession as the Brownfields Amendment. So the first thing that this amendment did is it provided some relief to the definition of owner-operator for potential buyers of these lands. Again, the cities asked for this to happen. In the city of Houston, we have a number of great examples of what happens when you pass a law like this. So, for example, Minute Maid Park was built on a brownfield here in Houston. So, the Astros play there now, but before it was a brownfield, it was an old railroad depot. It had lots of contamination in the soils around it. Now it's a beautiful park, and they've actually retained parts of the original structure. So it's very cool. It's got a lot of history associated with it. The Aquarium Restaurant, which is actually part of the Landry's chain, it was built on a brownfield. Hobby Center for the Performing Arts, also a Brownfields redevelopment project. And then there are many smaller ones too, but you'll find these in cities all over the country. So this act really had an impact on downtown areas, and cities were able to revitalize them because of this. The Brownfields Amendment, okay, so the Brownfields Amendment defines a brownfield as real property, the expansion, redevelopment of, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence of or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. Again, it's very specific. It says it's real property, so it's got to be a piece of land, and it's a piece of land which is intended or hopefully could be reused, but it could be contaminated. And the Brownfields Amendment specifically excludes certain sites. So you can't be on the national priorities list. You cannot put a current Superfund site into the Brownfields program. They're excluded. If there's an administrative order on consent by some governmental agency ordering cleanup, you can't be part of the Brownfields program. So basically, you can't be a known actor on a known piece of property with known contamination that is being cleaned up and join this project. It's about these sites where people don't know what's going on, and we want to redevelop them. So you have to kind of be at the beginning of the process with your property before you can define it as a brownfield and have it be part of what we call the different brownfields programs. So brownfield itself is a piece of property. It's a piece of property we'd like to do something with, usually in an urban area, but we know that there could be contamination on it. There's a risk of that. And then brownfields also refers to a couple of federal and state programs. And these programs are programs which assist people in developing these projects and redoing these brownfields and revitalizing these lands. And so the Brownfields Amendment, it excluded certain properties. It created these grants and loans and technical assistance programs, not only created them, but provided funds for them. And all of it with the objective of encouraging redevelopment of these formerly occupied sites rather than going out and developing industrial processes and projects on new lands, which would then become contaminated. So it's about trying to reuse what we've got. It is one of the essential reuse, reprogramming, revitalization examples that we have out here in the environmental world. Are there any questions so far?
Larissa is asking, can a brownfield site become redesignated as a Superfund site if an imminent threat develops during the restoration or later?
Indeed, it can. And as we go through the process here of what we do, we're going to investigate the site. And when we investigate the site, if we determine that there is an imminent threat, it can easily go out of the brownfields process and into the Superfund process. Sadly, I do not know of cases where that has happened personally, but I'm sure it has happened, because anytime you investigate an industrial site, there is that risk, which is why we have the whole Brownfields Amendment in the first place. The important thing is that, if you're going to do a brownfields redevelopment project, you purchase this land. And so if you've purchased this land and you're going through the brownfields redevelopment process and you determine through your investigation that there is imminent threat, you still don't have to pay for it, right? You're still not you as the owner don't get loaded with CERCLA liability. Yes, it would go into the Superfund process, but whoever was responsible for that contamination would then be brought in as the liable parties, and you wouldn't be one of them. And that's the important distinction here. So even if it were to go to the national priorities list, because of the work you're doing on it, you're not going to get hooked with that liability. And that's a really important point. Basically, the Brownfields Amendment, not just did it create these nice grant programs and define brownfield forests, but it also specified some defenses against CERCLA liability. And if you go through the brownfields process, what you do is you basically establish that you qualify for one of these defenses. And so there are 3 of them. And the first one is the innocent landowner defense. And that basically says, and I use the example here, I inherited this from my uncle. I never did anything on this property. I never contaminated it in any way. I just wound up with it. Now, maybe I inherited from my uncle, or maybe I'm a bank and I repossessed it because of taxes that weren't paid or mortgages that weren't paid on it. But I never did anything out there. I never operated it. I didn't do anything. Or even if I did operate it, I never did anything on it. I had a corner market there, or I had some small business there that had no contamination associated with me at all when I operated it. So I didn't do anything here. And the Brownfield says, okay, if you can establish this, then you get this defense. You're an innocent landowner. You might be a contiguous property owner, and this is another defense that says I didn't do anything, and the contamination on this property didn't come from me at all. It's because I've got that site over there, that Superfund site, or that RECRA site, and they contaminated their groundwater and it migrated onto my property. Or they have all these piles of dust and waste that have asbestos in it, and it blew onto my property, right? So I didn't do anything. I'm an innocent landowner. I live here, or I have a baseball field here, but it got contaminated, because or I have an industrial property, but I didn't do anything that created that contamination, because that's not what I do here. So you're a contiguous property owner. And then finally, and this is the one that most often happens through the brownfields process, is I'm a bona fide purchaser. I am buying this land for redevelopment, and I never owned or operated anything on this parcel in the past. I'm a good Samaritan. I'm buying this to go through the brownfields process and redevelop it, and I qualify as a bona fide purchaser. And so the Brownfields Amendment created these 3 exemptions or defenses against CERCLA liability. And it basically says how you qualify for them. And you qualify for them through conducting something we call all appropriate inquiries. And that's a phase 1 environmental site assessment. We're going to talk about that a little bit later here in the presentation. But it basically says you can qualify for these, and here's how you do it. And how you do it is an integral part of the Brownfields redevelopment program. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what the Brownfields program provides in terms of support, and then we're going to look at the process. The federal brownfields programs are administered by the EPA, and they involve a series of grant programs, loans, multi-purpose grants, job training grants. And so now I'm actually going to show you some of those programs. And so this is, and the link's in the presentation, but this is the EPA's Brownfields website. As you see here, for example, right now, they have a National Brownfields Training Conference. So it's a big program. And again, they've, sustainable communities start here. So they have a strong sustainability focus. And then there are some basic information. So the basic information is here, how it works. This is all the good stuff. It's like why we're great. But then these are the key resources they provide. So there are grants, is technical assistance, training and research, money. There are various kinds of tools and resources for communities, all of them available here through this website. So if we go out for a second and look at the types of grant funding, you can see a list of them here. There are grants to actually do assessment, to actually look at what's happening on your site. There are loans. There are actually specific cleanup grants. There are multi-purpose grants for cities who have a lot of these in one area. There are job training grants. which a community can apply for in order to train local residents to work on these sites rather than having to export the jobs that can be associated with redevelopment. And then there are some response grants that can go to states and tribes for essentially enhancing their state programs around this. Because in general, Brownfields grants and these programs are exported to the states. The states do a lot of brownfield redevelopment work, but all the information that you need, all the information your students need, is up here on the Brownfields website. So they can read all about it. They can study this. There are, again, lots of tools. And you can actually look up over here under EnviroFacts, you can actually look up and see what's going on in your area of the state. So you can look at all the brownfields that have been done in your state, ones that are being evaluated, lots and lots of information here. It's a great resource.
So are these brownfield sites owned by individual landowners or are they owned by the city? And is there like a real estate website for purchasing brownfields?
Great question. Let me go back to my PowerPoint and we're going to talk about who can do this. Great question. Who's eligible to do this? Okay, if you officially want to do a brownfield under a federal or state program, you have to be a municipality or a nonprofit economic development entity. If you're doing this and you want to get federal assistance or state assistance, you have to be a municipality or nonprofit economic development entity. And that's who has to own the land. You have to purchase this land if you don't already own it. In many cases, the cities, the counties, the state already do have this land because it's gotten returned to them over time, but they may not, in which case they have to find a way to purchase it. And one of the ways they often do that is that this next part of my slide is they can partner with a for-profit entity to do the redevelopment. They have to have a legal agreement to work together, and then they can cost share. And the for-profit entity can enter into an agreement with them to buy the land. So, for example, in the city of Houston, Aquarium Restaurant, obviously Landry's there is the for-profit entity, and they partnered with the city to do the redevelopment to get the money to do the assessment, and then they invested to build the eventual end use. And so you see this all the time that cities will partner with a for-profit organization to purchase the land and then to do the redevelopment. But they're the eligible entity to get the brownfields money, not that for-profit entity. So it can't be a private individual. It has to be a municipality, a state, a tribe, or a not-for-profit economic development corporation. And they have to be, again, they're the qualified partner, but sometimes the deep pockets come from a for-profit entity. Again, Minute Maid Park was developed, along with the Houston Astros as their for-profit partner. So it just depends. Hobby Center for the Performing Arts, on the other hand, I believe it still belongs to the city. And so the city did that one without a partner because they wanted to build a community, have an arts center that belongs to the city. Don't know that absolutely for sure, but I'm pretty sure Hobby Center still belongs to the city of Houston. So it just depends, but you're absolutely right. Individuals cannot apply for these. It has to have that not-for-profit or municipal entity partner in order to qualify. So state brownfields programs are really important because, especially in Texas, but in almost every other state, the money's coming through the state. And so in Texas, there are two agencies that administer brownfields programs. And first of all, it's the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. And they house brownfields in their voluntary cleanup program. And so we're going to look at their website for a minute. And, if you go back, when you go to their website, you'll see links to both of them on each website. They go back and forth. In Texas, to redevelop a brownfield and get state funding, you must enroll your site in the voluntary cleanup program as soon as you buy it for the purposes of brownfield redevelopment. So before you do any site assessment, before you do any investigation, you got to sign up and you work with the state project manager throughout the process. And I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about why you do that. But that's the requirement in Texas. You've got to sign up for the voluntary cleanup program. So let me run out to Google again, and we'll take a look at Texas's VCP. So this is the VCP in Texas. And you'll see right now, this is actually Brownfield site assessments, but I'm going to go to voluntary cleanup first, and we'll come back to site assessments. You don't have to be a brownfield to sign up for the VCP in Texas, but if you want to do a brownfields redevelopment, you have to be in it. So there are lots of other sites of other kinds that are in the voluntary cleanup program. It isn't uniquely for brownfields, but they use it, state of Texas uses it to help people voluntarily clean up contaminated sites rather than have to go to enforcement. They don't like enforcement. So again, you don't have to be a brownfield, but many of the sites that are in here are working with the Texas Brownfield redevelopment program. And you'll see here, they basically say it is a brownfields program. But again, it's not the only thing. And in order to enter it, you have to submit an application. You pay them $1,000. You put together some core data, which is not very much, and any previously prepared reports, and you sign up and you get a project manager. So I want to go back, though, to what the state actually does for you. So you have to sign up for the VCP, but in the state of Texas, they give you all sorts of cool stuff. If you clean up a site through Texas, they actually provide these services for you. So they will provide environmental site assessment and investigation and technical oversight, along with grants, with helping you through the grant program to get your money. They do technical assistance to local governments. They will do targeted site assessment. So they actually have contractors on staff that will do this. Well, not on staff, but on contract will do this for you. So you have to sign up for the program, but if you do, you get a lot of help and you can get money, which is, again, really critical. The other thing you get through the VCP in Texas is you also get what they call innocent owner operator certificates, which are like innocent owner operator exemptions from CERCLA, only for state liability. So once you go through the voluntary cleanup program and you work with the state project manager in doing your assessment, you can get a certificate that it absolves you of any state liability for anything you may find on your site. And I also wanted to mention that the Texas Railroad Commission also does brownfields, but they're specific to sites that have been contaminated through oil and gas development. So there are actually two of them. We don't hear very much about the Texas Railroad Commission's process, but they do it too. And these tend to be rather large sites, so they're big in the program too. But in Texas, the two programs kind of work together, but the Railroad Commission also has oil and gas specific brownfields programming. So again, I talked about who is eligible for Brownfields grants and loans and doing this. And again, it's municipalities and nonprofits partnering with a for-profit if they want to. It's important to know that these loans and grants have some caps. So in order to do site assessment and investigation, it's $250,000. If you want to go get cleanup loans, it can be up to $1 million. But there are also waivers you can apply for, which will give you more money. So if you have a bigger site, you want to file for a waiver to the cap, you can do that. So there's a lot of money been put into these programs with the purpose of redeveloping these urban brownfields, revitalizing this land. And the other thing is the for-profit partner will often cover these additional costs above whatever the grant pays for. So that's their contribution for their part of the partnership. And it just depends on the size of the site and how contaminated it is. Lots of other site conditions really determine how much it's going to cost to do your site assessment and your cleanup. The process involves basically 4 steps. You're going to assess the site. And to do that, it's the same as completing all appropriate inquiries, a phase 1 environmental site assessment. Same thing you would do to avoid CERCLA liability is the same thing you do for brownfields redevelopment. You do a first stage assessment by doing a phase 1 environmental site assessment. The next thing you do is if that environmental site assessment identifies potential sources of contamination, you go to a full site investigation. And that's a phase 2 environmental site assessment, which involves sampling and analysis. And I'm going to go into some more detail on each of these for you. Once you've done your sampling and analysis and you have data on what your contaminants are, where they are, how bad they are, you're going to do a risk assessment. And the risk assessment is based on determining whether or not you have what we call a complete exposure scenario. And a complete exposure scenario means you have sources of contamination, you have migration pathways, which can get those contaminants from your source to something else. And then finally, you have receptors that could be exposed to those source contaminants through those migration pathways. So you have to have that full exposure scenario, and you have to have it for whatever your proposed end use is. And end use is really critical here because the end use essentially determines how much risk you can tolerate on the site. If you have an end use where you're going to get a lot of exposure to, say you want to go to residential development, so you might have children playing on the soils or playgrounds or people living there 24/7. There's a lot more potential for exposure to contaminants on the site than if you're going to pave the entire thing over and put a commercial facility on it, like a ballpark or a hobby center, where essentially, you basically pave the whole property. So it depends on what you're doing, whether or not this scenario is complete, because you can protect your receptors in a lot of ways. You can protect them by putting a barrier between them and the potential and the contaminants. Again, pavement, a building. You can protect them by making it a site where people just move through it and don't live or work there. So they might be there for a short period of time, but they're not going to be there 24/7. And then, if you want to go to a situation where you're going to have full-scale residential development, you can clean it up and remove the contaminant. So you have choices in terms of your end use as to how this contaminant, the exposure scenario, does or doesn't complete itself for your site. So first of all, you've got to identify the sources, you've got to identify the pathways, and you've got to identify those potential receptors. And you do that through the investigation of your site. Once you do that, you take a look at your end use and you decide whether that's complete for the end use that you want to have. And if you do have the potential to expose receptors, you're going to have to go to site cleanup. And how clean you go depends on whatever that end use is as well. And usually we develop that, and this goes back to why we want a state project manager on the case. They help you determine how clean you have to get, what those standards are you have to meet using the processes in the Texas Risk Reduction Program. So Texas Risk Reduction is also a part of this. Let me hop out here to Google. We'll look at it for just a section.
If you go back to that migration pathway, do they consider like worst case scenario? For example, in downtown Houston, on a given day, when you're talking about migration pathways, you could have it be nearby you or something. But then there's a scenario like Hurricane Harvey, which then could end up, changing
Everything.
Yeah. So how is that assessed?
Worst case scenario planning is generally the best. However, the state doesn't like that so much. So I think they like to look at kind of most likely cases. It depends too on how toxic the contaminant is you're dealing with. So for example, if you're dealing with something that a lot of sites deal with, which is, petroleum contamination from activities that were on the site, not oil and gas development, but just, gasoline, that sort of thing. That's a lot different than if you find you have PCBs and dioxins, right? And honestly, if you have something that toxic like PCBs and dioxins, you might be heading over to Superfund because those are so toxic at such low levels. And it's very unlikely that you're going to be allowed under any scenario to leave those on the site. But if you're dealing with biodegradable contaminants like petroleum products, it's very likely that they're going to give you an end use that says, well, even if you have a Hurricane Harvey where everything floods at your site, you still, the worst case scenario is you're going to get some runoff of this biodegradable material into the local waterways. And given, again, it depends so much on your site whether or not that's high risk, but you're going to have to assess it. So yeah, you're going to have to look at it, but you don't necessarily have to clean up to the standard required that says that's going to happen. Risk is always calculated by the level of harm associated with the contaminant times the probability of it happening. So when you talk, if you have a fairly modest risk for the contaminant of concern, and then you have a low level of probability for the event, you're going to have a low risk for that. Whereas if you have a really high toxicity contaminant that has very high level of harm associated with it, even if you multiply that by a low probability event, you're still going to get a high risk. So you actually do risk calculations on this to determine whether or not you need to go to that next level. And that's what Texas Risk Reduction Program does. They do those calculations for you. And it depends on the specific risk of your contaminant and then the specific probability of the event that could spread it. Frankly, they're a lot more concerned about things like groundwater contamination. So for example, if you have groundwater contamination on your site of something that's volatile, it would be a lot more worried about things like vapors migrating up into your building or into the local utility corridors. So they're going to be a lot more concerned about that than they are about perhaps a surface event, because that's right there and can be very damaging. So that migration pathways from groundwater to your site, and then I agree with you, contamination that could potentially migrate in from surrounding sites is also an issue. And for your end use and your risk assessment, you have to take that into account. Now, it doesn't mean you have to clean it up because you may not be able, you can't, it's associated with your site, but it still affects the risks associated with your end use. So, if you're trying to build, and we deal with this all the time, right? We're dealing with this up in the 5th Ward right now in Houston, where we have a huge, housing residential areas right next to an old rail yard that has lots of contaminants on it. Well, those houses are already there, but the risk is high, and so they're talking about what they can do with this rail yard because these homes, because of wind, because of contaminated soils, and because of groundwater issues, they're all at risk. So if you're redeveloping land there, you don't want to put residential out there because you've got this enormous contamination opportunity because of what's adjacent. So that's and again, in those cases, those houses have been there for decades. But if you're building a new project, you don't want to build residential there. You want to put something there that reduces and minimizes the potential for people to be exposed to whatever's going on that site. So your end use may have to change. Again, you shouldn't have to change the end use for something adjacent because you should already know about that before you bought it. I mean, it's really hard to hide a really contaminated industrial site next door to you. It's right there. So you should be able to know or make some pretty good assessments of where you are and what's an appropriate use for your land. Yeah, it's all critical thinking here. It's all doing what makes the most sense. And you have help, right? You have help. You've got people in finance, marketing, attorneys working with you when you develop all of this. You're not working in a bubble. You may be looking at we as environmental professionals, which is what I teach, we may be looking at the environmental issues, but all of the associated legal and liability issues that are associated with might be around you is also taking place with other people who are on your team. So you do this, you don't do this in a bubble. So I'm tend to look at it here from the environmental side, but there's a financial, market, legal side all going on at the same time. So once you complete that risk assessment, if you determine that you need to, you're going to go on and you're going to do a site cleanup. And again, you implement some sort of a remediation strategy. You do that in concert with your state program manager. And you do that so that you can reduce the site risk to whatever level they determine is appropriate for the end use that you want to do. And they basically help you. They set those standards for you, and then you get to meet them. So I'm going to give a quick overview here of these different processes. This comes from a document that I'm actually going to make sure that you guys have in your resources. Phase 1 site assessment. A phase 1 site assessment is how we do the initial overview to determine what might be out here on the site. And there are 4 steps to it. I'm not going to read this slide. I'm only going to read the titles, but a phase 1 doesn't do any sampling analysis. Phase 1, that's why we call it site assessment and not investigation. It's a records review. It's a site visit. It's interviews with important or knowledgeable persons about the site, and then writing it up as a report. And this is set up as there's actually an ASTM standard that tells you how to do this. But again, it's a paper and a verbal assessment. So you talk to people, you look at historic records, aerial photos, state databases that might have any information on what might have happened on your site or around it. But it's all a paper assessment. And so you start with that. That's that all appropriate inquiries. This is what you complete in order to absolve yourself of CERCLA liability. So it's a paper review. It doesn't actually require you to go out there and test anything. But this is what the law says. This is what the Brownfields Amendment says you have to do in order to get one of those exemptions from CERCLA liability. The state goes right along with it. They say, you do this, and you get the state certificate as well. And this is where you get out of your liability. So it's just this first assessment step. The next step is a site investigation. And the site investigation is where you actually do diving into sampling and analysis to determine what your contaminants are. And so I'm going to pop out here to Google again and show you this document. Again, I'll provide it for you. This is a phase 2 site investigation. And this document is called Technical Approaches to Redeveloping Brownfields. Big old document. It's 76 pages, but it has these great flowcharts in it. And so a site investigation is to identify the type, the quantity, and the extent of contamination on your site. So first of all, you do this thing setting your data quality objectives. You establish what screening levels you're looking at, and then you go out there and you conduct environmental sampling and analysis. So you conduct these sampling and analysis, you sample, you collect data, and you write up a report. And once you've done that, you can then determine whether or not, through risk assessment, whether or not you do a cleanup at the site. So again, EPA has tons of resources out there to help people do these. And it goes into details that I actually don't even hit in my graduate classes, but you never know with Envirothon how much they're going to want you kids to know. So I'm going to provide these resources, and for your teams where you have kids who like to go down the regulatory rabbit hole, this document is just wonderful for that. So it shows you these sorts of, again, it shows you this process. If you do have to go to a cleanup, and that's our last step, but we can go to site cleanup. And EPA, again, has this great website out here on how to green cleanups. And I really like that because, again, in looking at the Envirothon requirements, there's like, how do you do this? How do you help communities make sure that the cleanup isn't harmful to them? Because it can be. I mean, if you're going to have a bunch of dirty stuff out there and you're cleaning up contaminants, it can affect a community. And so this is EPA's website on how to get greener cleanups. And so it talks about, again, where principles, how to do it for Superfund, regional and state implementation. There are some examples of it. Core elements about how to do it for energy, how to do it for the air, the water, how to do materials and waste and land and ecosystems. So you can look at all of these different areas here, work with your students and determine how they could do a cleanup better. I mean, there's even, there's this one here, there's even a best management practices for what you can do depending on the kind of site you have. So for example, here, you want to reduce total energy use renewable energy sources if you can, reducing air pollutants and greenhouse gases, use less water, preserve water quality around your site, conserve resources, reduce waste, and protect land and ecosystem services. And there's lots of nice fact sheets here that you can look at that are really common technologies used on cleanups. For example, soil vapor extraction and air sparging, really commonly used for cleaning up volatile contaminants. How can you do that in a more clean way? How can you use renewable energy when you do your site cleanup? If you have leaking underground storage tanks, how can we do that cleanup in a more clean way? Because there's been a gasoline, which is very volatile. How do you do a mining site? Mining sites tend to be enormous. Butte, Montana's got to deal with this. What's the waste management look like? How do you green that? So EPA has a whole plethora of information here that you and your students can look at, can evaluate, how you do these in a more environmental friendly way to protect the community while we're going through this. So the last thing I want to share with you, and again, it's this really wonderful document that EPA has out there, and the link is in my presentation, but I'm gonna show it to you here. This is Brownfield's roadmap, interactive roadmap to understanding options for site investigation and cleanup for brownfield sites. And it's actually a pretty old document, but I still use it in my classes because it really lays out what the process looks like. And up here in the front of it, there's some explanatory material, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you back here to the roadmap itself, which is in landscape, and you're going to get seasick again as I flip it around. I'm going to make it a little bigger for you. This is an interactive roadmap that is a great tool for helping people understand what this process is. And so the roadmap here is very clear. It's a really nice visual on how to clean up, what to do with a brownfield. It talks, and you can start here at the very beginning. There are definitions. They talk about building a conceptual site model. But every one of these little boxes and question marks has what they call over here on the right a spotlight. And so if I hit assess the site here, it's going to take me to this really nice, concise description of how we do a site assessment. And again, it's 2 pages, talks about phase 1 environmental site assessment, gives you that definition of a brownfield. But again, it's short. It's just 2 pages. 3, I guess, but it's short. It's not very long, and it tells you how to do this. You can again go back. Whoops. This is the main site for it. The link is in my PowerPoint. We can put it on the website for you. Every one of these spotlights, and they're also called out here at the side, so you can, if you want to go to greener cleanup best practices that we just talked about, you can click on number 7 down here and take you right there. If you want to understand what institutional controls are, you can click on that one. Again, and each of these boxes out here, right here, work with a government agency to mitigate threat. That's if you find that there's a problem. This is where we would wind up maybe at Superfund if our site investigation finds a bunch of contamination. But each of these click boxes takes you to more information. So I really love this roadmap. Again, I think it's a great tool for students because what's written on it is just so approachable. Again, lots of documents. This one is in site investigation, but right before that, we talk about the conceptual site model, how to draw your site, how to build a picture of it in your mind on a piece of paper that everybody can look at. And also it gives you this, and then it tells you how you use the conceptual site model through the process of investigation, designing your cleanup, doing your cleanup, and actually going to your redevelopment. So you can use this model all the way through the process. But again, it gives you a really nice, concise description, very readable, investigating the site. And so this is how you do that site investigation, the sampling and analysis, how you do it effectively. And again, the roadmap consistently gives you this, again, opportunity to look at the different elements of the process. So I just love it and want your students to have it so they can work from it. It really encompasses everything you're going to know and everything they're going to know about brownfields. With that, I will stop my share and I'll take any questions.
When you're going through the presentation, a lot about it was once the non-private entity, so the person is going to go ahead and redevelop it, these were all the steps. And you were mentioning a lot of times individuals don't want to go into that because of CERCLA liability. Like, what's the consequence of a private person purchasing a brownfield? Like, what do they, like, this seems like a lot of these steps, but what's the benefit of going through the process of having like this? Is it just the state and federal backup and the money and the grant? Because if not, they have to do it all themselves. Like, what does it mean by CERCLA liability? Like, what is the consequences of a private entity purchasing something like this?
So if a private entity purchases this, they don't, a private for profit, and they can't go through the state process. Okay, two questions. They can still get exemption from CERCLA liability. So you as a private landowner can do a commercial property transaction to buy a contaminated piece of property. What you would do is you would still complete a phase 1 environmental site assessment on it before you buy it. You would make an agreement, and commercial real estate agents all know how to do this. You would make an agreement with the seller that before you buy it, you're going to do a phase 1 environmental site assessment on it and complete all appropriate inquiries under that Brownfields Amendment. Because by doing that, you determine whether or not there is contamination on the site, and you exempt yourself under bona fide purchaser from liability for it. Now, the seller may not want to do that because they might be like, I know there's contamination and I don't want to tell you about it. Well, that's a big red flag. But if they don't know, if they really don't know, but they want to sell their property, they should agree with you that they will do they may pay for the phase one, but if phase one takes place on that site and comes back and lets you know what the potential liabilities are, what potential environmental issues are, then the bona fide purchaser can either purchase it privately and go ahead and do their redevelopment. They may enroll it in the voluntary compliance program and do a cleanup with the state. They don't qualify for grant money, but they still qualify for the voluntary cleanup program. They can still work with the state project manager. They just have to pay for everything. But they don't get stuck with CERCLA liability. So if they go to that next stage and they do an investigation and sampling and analysis, and they find out that they've got, solvents in their groundwater, well, now they own it and they have to clean it up. They're working with the state to do that voluntarily, and they don't have to. Again, if it's determined that it becomes CERCLA level harm, they're not a potentially responsible party under CERCLA. They don't have to pay for that. It goes to the Superfund program. Other money comes in from other sources to take care of that. And the people who did cause that contamination get put on the hook to clean it up. But the current owner, if they've done that first phase one, all appropriate inquiries, isn't a potentially responsible party, and they're not involved in the money or the liability. They can essentially, now they may own a property that's contaminated, which is no fun, which is why you do this first, to make sure you didn't buy something where that was really obvious. But if you bought it because your phase one showed that there really wasn't anything significant, there shouldn't be anything really significant, right? Phase one should tell you if there's something significant, and you probably would back away from buying that, right? But if the phase one says, it looks like it's in pretty good shape, I'm going to have to do some additional, you may not have to do anything additional, but if you have to do some additional work, it may be $10,000, $20,000 worth of work. You do that investigation, you narrow down the issue, and you're like, okay, I'm good to go. I have CERCLA liability. I'm working with the voluntary cleanup program for this little bit of contamination I found over here in my soil. We're going to clean that up, and I'm going to go do my new project. And all of that goes through the commercial real estate project process until you get to the point where you say, yeah, I have some contamination. And then you go to the voluntary cleanup program. But you don't get state money or brownfield money to do it.
Now, once you're protected under the CERCLA and that you go into the program, say contamination, especially solvents, are found, if an individual wants to create a civil lawsuit, that wouldn't go to the new owner, it would go to the original contaminator. So that kind of protects you in that way as well. Is that what you're saying too?
Right.
Okay.
If the developer decides to make let's say an apartment complex or a condominium, do they have to disclose to the people that are either buying the condos or renting the apartments that this is a brownfield site?
They do not. They do not have to.
I want to take your class. Fascinating.
That's a nice compliment. Thank you. It really is a very interesting program, and it's really fun when you get into the investigation side of it. I always tell my students that with a bachelor's degree, you're going to get to do phase ones, and mostly they're really boring because they're like the corner gas station, and there's nothing much going on, and it's like or a shopping center, and all these real estate transactions. Every real estate transaction on the commercial side right now does a phase one for it, just in case they just do one, because they're cheap. They're cheap and fast.
You're a professor. What majors are the students that take your class getting? Like, what are they majoring in?
Environmental management. And I do actually have some in environmental science and come over, but this is environmental management. My majors, this is the capstone course in my major. So they learn all about how to do site assessment and why. And so we do brownfields to start with, and then we do NEPA. So we do site assessment under NEPA, site assessment under CERCLA.
Okay, so if we have a Superfund site that has been mitigated to an acceptable level, and then that now can be purchased for a brownfield, correct? Or is it once it's a Superfund, it's always just going to be kind of like, we need to just leave this be? This is basically, we're going to have to call this a loss. So those are not purchasable?
They're purchasable, but they're not purchasable under brownfield.
Okay.
People do buy them and people do things with them, but not under brownfield. They are not considered a brownfield. They're considered Superfund. And it's a great question because I think it's kind of a gray area, because once they're off the NPL list, but they so often they still have some kind of a remediation order on them. So, for example, we have the one here in near us here is the Brio site, right? The Brio site went onto the NPL in 1997. Well, it's off the NPL list. It's now a former NPL site, but they still have a cleanup on the site. They're still under an administrative order from the state to keep that groundwater remediation system going, and that can't be repurchased for redevelopment.
Okay, and if it was, it would be the idea that, so the Brio they have that cap on there, and we have to maintain that cap, that impermeable cap. So whatever, if it does get used, you have to make sure that you maintain the integrity of what we have put there, or increase its integrity, correct?
Exactly.
Okay. And the Brio is exactly what I was thinking of.
Yeah, and under Superfund, you have to disclose, right? And that's another problem, is that site, you'd have to disclose to whatever end use you put there that this was a former site. And so, community right to know says that people need to know what that is. And there's ways to kind of maybe squirrel around that, but Brio is a great example of one where it's never going to be redeveloped. And again, they currently have an active groundwater containment process, and I mean, it's in perpetual care. That site will never be cleaned up. It's not going anywhere. And that's not uncommon with Superfund sites.
And that couldn't be used for just a nature preserve or a prairie. I think we had talked about when we did native grasslands, the Brio came up with that we're going to make it a prairie. We're going to have basically these natural mitigation systems on top of the cap. So but in this case, it's basically, if it's a Superfund, we're going to call it a loss. Even though there's something that can be minimally done to improve, resale values of the surrounding neighborhoods and communities, that's where that risk and that money comes into play. It's not worth it financially. Maybe yes for our neighbors, but not for us as a municipality.
As an entity. Yeah, I mean, if we're going to do it if it got, for example, if it went over to belong to the community and the community wanted to do that as community service, then it could happen. But nobody can purchase it and just do that. I mean, again, unless they're going to just do it, if they gave it to Texas Parks and Wildlife and Texas Parks and Wildlife decided to put a prairie on it, as long as they can, but they are not going to buy it because they don't want to have to maintain that groundwater pumping system, right? Because that system is still in place. And if it were just the cap, I think it could, because then you just don't disturb the surface. But because there's that active groundwater groundwater pumping system out there, it's not going to get redeveloped because nobody's going to buy that and maintain it. And so it's really the active remediation system that is there that keeps it from anything being done to it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
You guys are very welcome. My pleasure. See you all soon.